Good evening, everyone. It's my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. My name is Bob Gibbs, and I am on the board of the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association. And in last year, we had a cattle feedlot operation proposed for our watershed, and I came to know our speaker in the defense of our lake in that application. Margaret Allan Newell is very well spoken, backed up by experience and backed up by very good credentials. Margaret is a consulting environmental engineer and a geoscientist since 1987. And she spent much of her career using human health risk assessment to clean up contaminated sites. And she is married to an Alberta beef producer, and they raise Black Angus cattle near Radway, Alberta. Wow. Margaret is now semi-retired from her consulting practice, and this year is serving as the vice president of the Alberta Association of Professional Engineers and Geophysicists. That's very impressive. So please welcome me in joining and bringing on Margaret to our podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm so pleased to be here and to be able to share the story. Tonight, I'm going to be telling you about a community's successful actions to prevent a feedlot from being built near them. My talk is going to focus on cattle and not on hogs, poultry, or other animals that end up in our grocery stores and are also regulated under the same provincial legislation for confined feeding operations. So I'm an environmental engineer and I'm married to a cattle rancher, and so that brings dual perspectives, and I'm going to share some of those perspectives with you this evening. In this talk, I'll be describing Alberta's beef production industry and the origin of feedlots, also known as confined feeding operations or CFOs. I'll be using those three terms pretty much interchangeably. Then, through the Pigeon Lake case study, I'll discuss the environmental impacts and highlight the factors that led to the proposed feedlot from being disallowed in this area. I'm going to ask you to hold questions to the end, at which point we'll be delighted to entertain some discussion. I'm going to start off with a question for you. Alberta has 4.5 million people and almost 5 million cattle. Why is this? Well, in the description for tonight's talk, I noted that Alberta leads Canada's cattle industry thanks to its vast grasslands and the dry climate that helps keep cattle healthy. The grasslands, which is the yellow part of this map, have a long history of ranching and beef production because the climate is more favorable there for grazing animals than it is for growing crops. After World War II, the demand for beef increased, and Alberta's first feedlot was established in the late 1950s near Strathmore, which is just east of Calgary. There are now over 150 confined feeding operations in Alberta. Many are in that grasslands area, and in fact, there's an area near Lethbridge, Alberta, that's called Feedlot Alley. Tonight, you're going to hear about a proposal to situate a confined feeding operation near Pigeon Lake, which is not in the grasslands area, but it's in a cooler natural region, which is shown in green as the boreal forest region. So it's somewhere down in this area here. All right, so what is a confined feeding area? Confined feeding operation. A confined feeding operation is a place where cattle are finished by feeding them rations that help them develop the desired amount of fat. So for example, the marbling that makes your steak nice and tender and juicy. Hundreds to thousands of animals are kept together where they can be easily fed and monitored. When the time comes to ship them, it is easier to sort and load cattle from one large facility than it is going to several smaller farms. Those efficiency in the feedlot settings mean that the meat can be sold at lower prices, and this makes beef more affordable to consumers. This is why we pay the amount that we pay for fast food hamburgers or the nice juicy steak that you might get in the grocery store. It would be so much more expensive if we did not have feedlots. So confined feeding operations are not necessarily a bad thing. So why can CFOs be problematic then? Well, if you've ever had to use an outhouse at an overcrowded festival or a campground, you'll appreciate that there's a point in which there's too much of a rich thing. In terms of pollution, imagine emptying that outhouse onto a beach. What kind of problems could you have? Well, it would make that beach unpleasant to use. It could pollute the lake and cause harm to freshwater aquatic life. It could also pollute water wells if there were any nearby. So while small amounts of manure act as a really good fertilizer, at some point, those increasing quantities can lead to pollution. When the number of cattle isn't excessive, those cow patties often are left to dry on the ground surface. So eventually they become part of the topsoil and support new plant life. So for example, at our ranch, this is what happens with our pasture lands in the summer. We just leave it to be, and the next year you'll see that there's really nice grass growing from them. In the winter, it's different because all of our cattle congregate in one area. And when the summer arrives, it's pretty rich. And so my husband collects that and composts it. You'll see in this photo here that there is a long windrow of the straw bedding and manure mixed together. And he continues to work that until it biodegrades. And at the end of that pile there, you can see some steam rising in the distance. That's proof positive that there's some biodegradation going on there. When it's done, this compost gets spread on our hay fields, and sometimes I steal some from my garden. So at a confined feeding operation, the manure gets managed differently. This is a photo of a cattle enclosure and manure catch basin, courtesy of Iowa State University. So what they do at these large facilities is they collect the manure in a large lined pit, which is called a catch basin. And when that gets full, they empty it and they spread that on cultivated land in the summer months. Can you just imagine the smell from that facility? Although this is a science talk, I do need to talk a little bit about the policy. There is a really nice 4-page fact sheet that the NRCB puts out. They are the ones that regulate confined feeding operations in Alberta. So if you go to the NRCB website, you can find that, and it provides a really good overview of the permitting process for confined feeding operations, the minimum setbacks from other kinds of developments, and who is allowed to respond if there is an application to build a confined feeding operation in a certain area. The NRCB has to follow its legislated processes because if it doesn't follow them to the letter, the decision that they will make is at risk of being overturned. So if they deny a feedlot and then somebody complains about it, they might end up having to approve it. So they have to be very careful about who they allow speak to these things. So who gets to speak to raise concerns? Well, the person who applied for it is allowed to, of course, speak in regarding their application and why they think it's a good thing to have in the area. The municipality is allowed to speak to it because they're the ones who have the municipal development plans. And then the other parties that are allowed to speak to it are people who are called directly affected parties. And they're the people who live nearest to where the confined feeding operation is going to be. In the case of Pigeon Lake, it was only about 1.5 miles. So although there's people from a larger area that might have objections, it was only the people that were granted directly affected status that were able to speak to the application and why they would find that that would be a problem for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Pigeon Lake case study. So in 2022, Bob and his group retained me to assess the environmental impacts that could result from this proposed confined feeding operation or feedlot on land that is just west of Pigeon Lake. And you can see the picture here. Actually, I stole that from Bob's website there, showing how pretty Pigeon Lake is. So the proponent was a cattle rancher who had submitted an application to the NRCB. The size of the proposed operation necessitated a formal process, including community consultation and a review and decision by an NRCB approval officer. And that's still following that policy that I had just previously described, and it's outlined in that 4-pager. The Pigeon Lake Watershed Association doesn't own any land and therefore cannot be granted directly affected party status. So what the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association did is they partnered with some residents who do have status because they lived very close. They were considered directly affected parties, and they had those parties include some of their reports along with their formal submissions. The other thing I want to tell you is when it is time to respond, directly affected parties are only given a few weeks to put together the materials and to submit it. That's a pretty short time to be able to put together a reason why you would be opposed to a confined feeding operation. So let me just show you where Pigeon Lake is. So you can see the red little bubble there towards the top of the map there. That's where the confined feeding operation was going to be, and the blue shape next to it is Pigeon Lake. Now, if you look at that map, you can see how big Pigeon Lake is. It looks on this map like it's larger than the entire city of Red Deer. It's a large lake. It's also one of the most intensely used recreation areas in Alberta. And I've got a list of some of the people who depend on it. Well, we've got over 2,000 private cottages, 15 communities, 2 provincial park sites, recreational developments that include golf courses, camping, RV parks, those sorts of things, and a First Nations reserve, Pigeon Lake Reserve number 138A. That is a satellite reserve that was established under Treaty 6 and is shared by 5 First Nations. So there's a lot of people that depend on Pigeon Lake. Pigeon Lake is a particularly sensitive ecosystem, and that's because the lake is shallow and susceptible to blue-green algae. The mean residence time is greater than 100 years, and that's because if you have a look at it, there's a whole bunch of streams coming in, total of 7 streams that are flowing in, and also the runoff that's coming in, but there's only 1 stream that's flowing out. So the water that comes in and any dissolved salts or nutrients that it's bringing in stays in that lake and it concentrates. And that's a problem when you have a lot of agricultural runoff. So because of that, the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association was formed around 2006 to try and manage the problems that the lake was having, provide stewardship for the lake, and they developed a Pigeon Lake Watershed Management Plan. One of the problems the lake is susceptible to is these blue-green algae blooms, and I'm going to be explaining to you what those are. There you go. Just wanted to bring up the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association's logo there. So the Watershed Management Plan is a really good document. It's comprehensive, it's based on science, and it provides action for protecting and improving the watershed around Pigeon Lake. So let's talk a little bit more about this algae problem. It's caused by something called cyanobacteria, and it results in what we call blue-green algae. And Pigeon Lake has had a decades-long challenge managing these sort of algae blooms. And if you want more information about this, I would suggest you have a look at the website put together by the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association. It explains what causes the algal blooms and how to prevent them. The main culprit is phosphorus, and that's present in runoff from developed lands. If you think about what's coming off of lawns and roads, for example, there's a fair bit of phosphorus that gets carried along in the runoff, goes into ditches, and can end up in the lake. Also agricultural lands. The area around Pigeon Lake has a lot of farmlands, and if there's fertilizer, well, that can contain nitrogen and phosphorus that come into the lake. Also manure from cattle, and also natural degrading plant matter. So there's a fair number of reasons why you could end up with these nutrients going into the lake. Is it a problem? Well, it's not just an aesthetic concern because it makes your beach look ugly. It actually is toxic to people and animals. Pets can get affected, life in the water and that sort of thing. And in humans, the most common side effects are rashes and skin irritation, but you can also get nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and fever. So it's not a good thing. It is a problem. So I'm going to talk a bit about the application. You can see there the form that's filled out. There's a lot of blank space on it here. But what it essentially says is that there would be 4,000 cattle that would be in pens on a total of 10 acres. So imagine if you had a 5-acre acreage and inviting 2,000 cattle over. That's the kind of density you're looking at. It'd be a lot of cattle in a small place. So in addition to the pens where the cattle are going to be, there would be the collection of their manure and spreading it on land up gradient of Pigeon Lake. All right, so This is how to go about predicting impacts. And this is what I do as environmental engineer, sort of frame some sort of a model or describe what the problem is, choose some sort of a predictive software to be able to predict what's going to happen, do the analysis. So in this case, put in the input specific to the Pigeon Lake site, and then find out what the results are. And when it's all done, write up a nice little report and tie it up with a bow. The first step is going to be putting together that conceptual site model to frame the problem. And let me show you what that looks like. There we go. So a conceptual site model, we often draw those as sort of a cartoon-like representation of a situation here. And it illustrates a few things: the source of pollution, where it can go to, and what it could affect. So in this case, we can see we've got some cattle, we've got the feedlot catch basin area. Think about that picture I showed you from Iowa there. That's what that's going to look like. It's actually pretty close to one of these little streams that flows towards Pigeon Lake. And then all the land around there would be where the manure is going to be spread on, and also has the opportunity to leach into towards Pigeon Lake. So I needed to build some sort of a computer model to be able to represent all of that. So when putting this together, in consultation with the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association, we decided that we would focus my analysis on the surface water impacts. If you have something like this, you could also cause impacts for groundwater, but the soils in this area are more clay than sand. And so what that means is when the rain comes, it's going to push the nutrients towards the lake rather than allow it to infiltrate down and towards the water table. So for what we were looking at, just to keep this thing to a reasonable size and to be able to fit it in within the time we had available, we kept the analysis just to surface water concerns. So what are we concerned about? What's in that manure anyway? Well, if you've ever had a chocolate chip cookie that looks like a manure patty, you're probably getting some butter, flour, eggs, sugar, and the all-important chocolate. When you have a cow patty, it's different. You've got 75% water, about 20% organic matter, and less than 1% of these fertilizer-like elements, including the phosphorus and nitrogen, that we call nutrients. And there's also going to be some natural bacteria and some trace elements. There is absolutely no chocolate. So for environmental risk assessment involving manure, we focus on three things: the phosphorus, which I mentioned feeds those cyanobacteria and fuels the blue-green algal blooms that we talked about. Nitrogen, which enhances the growth of aquatic plants, and when it does that, well, it consumes oxygen. And the other thing is the biodegradable organic matter. So when we've got the nitrogen and we've got the organic matter degrading, both of those things consume dissolved oxygen in the lake. And what that does is it makes so that other life in the lake can't thrive. So they start to die off, or they suffocate in essence. So we're concerned about the algal blooms and then this loss of oxygen, which we call eutrophication. All right. So we have to put together a response really quickly. At times like this, when I'm under stress to put something together really good in a short time frame, a quote by Woody Allen comes to mind. Woody Allen, filmmaker, comedian, actor, said, "It is clear that the future holds great opportunities. It also holds pitfalls. The trick will be to seize the opportunities, avoid the pitfalls, and get back home by 6 o'clock." So how are we going to do this? Well, one of the things you do is you keep it simple. You keep it to something that people can understand. So I decided we would build some sort of a model here that could calculate the incremental loads from the nitrogen and the phosphorus and compare them against water quality guidelines. And what I found when we looked at Alberta's guidelines for surface water is very clear. The guidelines say there should be no increase in nitrogen, total nitrogen, or phosphorus over existing conditions. So all we have to do is prove that there would be something that would be non-zero. Pretty straightforward. So that's what we focused on. And I built a model just to try and compare what kind of concentrations we would get. So run a simulation, put together a report, and have it submitted by the directly affected parties, since the Pigeon Lake Water Association was not able to submit it themselves. All right, so my model didn't focus on some of the other side issues that residents have, which are totally valid concerns. There would be concerns for things like odors, maybe flies or bugs that are coming off the manure, the traffic associated with trucks and trailers coming to pick up or drop off cattle, groundwater concerns, and those sorts of things. Those were not part of my report. They got presented under separate cover. So where am I going to get a model from? Okay, so a model is some sort of a computer application. And an analogy I'd like to give you is, let's say you're going to use Google Maps and you're going to try to figure out how to get from one place to another. So you'll type into Google Maps that I want to get from here to here. And what the model does in the background, and you don't see anything, it's just a black box. It figures out all the various routes for you to be able to get from one point to the other, and it tells you how long it's going to take to get there. Pretty slick, eh? Well, we need to do something different. It's kind of similar, but we're putting together, okay, I got so much cattle, they're producing so much manure, they're on this type of soil, there's going to be some drainage, some overland flow, depending on whether it's going over bare soil or through trees and grass, the rate that's going to get there is going to be faster or slower. Oh, and we got that rain thing coming in, and that can really flush some of the contaminants a little further. So those are the inputs. And then the model does its magic. And on the other side, we get to find out how much runoff production there's going to be, what the concentration increases might be in the water bodies. And then we can look at that and we could figure out whether there is going to be a non-zero effect on Pigeon Lake. Pretty slick. Okay. So I went looking for models and I tried to, should I build a model or should I try and get one? So the challenge is I normally build my own models for doing risk assessments because then I understand the math that they're using and all the rest of that. But when you're trying to present to a board, which you know has to turn around its decision really quickly, they might not have the time to read my entire report and understand what I'm doing. So they don't know if they trust what I did and whether the model is right. So I decided instead that I would use a model that was developed by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. They're a really well-known and respected authority on risk assessment. And they had one that was called the Pollutant Load Estimation Tool, PLET. And that was pretty new, 2022. Purpose-built for these kinds of scenarios, determining loadings that you might get from feedlots. The challenge is it really was a black box. It was a website that you type your values in and then you would get the results, and I couldn't tell what it was doing. But I went back and did some further digging around, and I found that they had the same tool had been a spreadsheet tool. And it was a few years earlier. I think it was a 2018 version, but it used the same math and everything. And as a spreadsheet, I could see the equations and what it was doing. The other problem with the online tool was you're supposed to say whereabouts in the United States you lived, and it would pull up your soil type and the rainfall. Well, we're not in the United States. So with the spreadsheet tool, I was able to override that with the soil type and drainage and rainfall that we get in the Pigeon Lake area. So that was pretty cool. So I went with that spreadsheet tool for estimating pollution loads, and it checked all those boxes. It was able to support our argument. It was from a credible source. It was adaptable to the site conditions at Pigeon Lake, and it was simple to run and easy to explain because it was documented by the US EPA. That was the way to do it. I will say there's a caution here. Whenever you're using somebody else's model, you have to do a bunch of runs in order to try and figure out what it's doing and be assured of what you're doing. It would be terrible to do the model and find out that what you thought it was doing was something else. And so there were a number of runs that I had to do. Well, what happens if I double the number of cattle? There should be twice as much manure, right? So just having a look to see what it does. What happens if I change the distances to things or change the rainfall? So there are a bunch of runs that I did to be confident that the model was doing what I expected it to be doing. All went well. It was really good. Okay, so the structure of the spreadsheet tool or the online one is the same thing. It has a number of user inputs there. So it's looking for the land use, for example, precipitation, irrigation, what type of soil and vegetation cover you have, how many animals you're putting on there, where the manure is being spread and that sort of thing. It also has the ability to handle other things like, well, if you're also adding sewer discharges, which bring nutrients. We didn't have to worry about that because we didn't have that. We've got the environmental processes, and then it would also look at ways that the pollution can be reduced by having setbacks, for example, no manure spreading right next to a creek, but it has to be separated by a certain number of meters. So I could tailor this thing so that the manure spreading practices would comply with the requirements of the Alberta operations for confined feeding operations, so that the methods that were required to be followed once a confined feeding operation is established would be modeled in the spreadsheet model, able to do that. So the three parameters that we had looked at, there's three of them. There was nitrogen and phosphorus. And remember, the other thing that was in the manure patty was the organic matter. Well, we modeled that a little bit differently. The problem with the organic matter is that it consumes oxygen. So the way we model that one is through a parameter called biological oxygen demand. How much oxygen is going to be depleted to degrade the organic matter? And that's the parameter. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and what we call BOD. So those are working on it. Now, the other interesting thing is because we're doing, sorry, there we are. We really just need to show what's going to be changing from the current situation with no confined feeding operation to what it looks like with a confined feeding operation. So there's a certain number of parameters that we did not have to go and try to establish the answers to. For example, we didn't have to worry about those sewer discharges because it doesn't matter. That's not going to change with the confined feeding operation before and after. So we're able to simplify this thing. Remember, keep it simple. So keep it simple and work with only the things that are going to change. And I'll just show you what that looks like. So what we would do is we develop a base case, which is what Pigeon Lake looks like right now. And then we would say, okay, what happens if we develop the confined feeding operation? And I just subtract the two numbers there. And the difference is the incremental loading. So we put in the cattle, the amount of phosphorus, nitrogen, and BOD that's generated, and divide that among what's happening at the feedlot versus what's happening with manure spreading. And we also looked at the scenario, what if there was so much rain that that catch basin overflowed and all of that material went down to the lake? What would that look like? We also looked at looking at different amounts of rain. So what happens if you've got less rain or more rain? And we also looked at what happens if you've got more cattle. Sometimes the confined feeding operation might get licensed for 4,000 head, but let's say they decide to expand later and have 10,000 or something like that. So we wanted to see, well, what effect would that have? So the base case was no CFO. The one that we're really interested in, the one for most of our comparison, is the one with the confined feeding operation that matched what the application looks like, but we did a few other ones just to see what those impacts would be. I'm going to show you where the confined feeding operation was relative to Pigeon Lake. So this is a map that the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association commissioned. And I'll move my cursor in here, we can see. This area here is where the cattle pens are. There's a catch basin right here, which is pretty close to that stream, Very close. And then the manure spreading lands are all this area here with the yellow outline around them. Okay, so large area, you can see how close it is to Pigeon Lake. That distance actually does meet the provincial requirements for having setback from surface water, but as you'll see, that was inappropriately close to Pigeon Lake here. The other thing that's of interest, as you see, I've got some red lines in here. Whoops, go back here. There, got some red lines in here. And what this is there are two sub-watersheds. So the development was going to straddle essentially two different creek areas. The one towards the north is called Tide Creek, and the one towards the south is called Sunset Harbor Creek. So we ran the model to look at those two watersheds together, and then because they're coming down two creeks that are both going into Pigeon Lake, we wanted to know what the total loading was going to be. All right. So what changes when you put the confined feeding operation? Well, the feedlot itself is pretty small. It was only, well, it's less than 5 hectares in size. So you can see this little lip over here. It's pretty small. The amount of urban land stays the same. We're not doing anything, adding any more commercial buildings or anything like that. The amount of forest land stays the same, not adding or taking away any trees. But you'll see there's a shift there between the pasture land and the cropland. And that's because right now there's some land that's being used for cattle grazing and it's not being tilled. Nobody's going out with a tractor and harrows and turning the soil. So the way that that land works is because the grass is in place there, it captures and holds onto the water. For manure spreading, somebody's going to be spreading the manure and using a tractor to try and mix that into the soil. And that changes the rate that the water passes through. So you'll get more overland transport there with what we call cropland. So essentially taking some of the pasture land and converting it to cropland is what happens. All right, so to describe the soil and drainage, the model allows you to choose from 4 different hydrologic soil groups. And essentially what those are is it's telling you how much water infiltration can happen. And you'll see that we've got on this chart here A, B, C, D. A being something that's got lots of sand and gravel perhaps, and something D has got essentially just clay, nothing else in it. And where Pigeon Lake falls in, if you look at the geological reports and drilling records in that area, is that there is a fair bit of clay, but there's also some silt and sand in there. So we put in hydrologic group C. So it's got a low rate of water transmission, but it's not the very low rate. It's the best match for the Pigeon Lake lands is that area C. All right, precipitation. This was really interesting because the NRCB requirements for determining the amount of precipitation requires the applicants to choose the weather station that is closest to them from the ones listed. So the application said, well, the closest weather station is the one at Kalmar. Kalmar is just northeast of Pigeon Lake. But you'll see that's in the white area of the map, and that is what we call parkland soils. So parkland soils are not as grassy and dry as the grasslands. They're the next one up. They're an area that's used for a lot of farming, for example. Where Pigeon Lake is, it's actually an extension of the boreal forest. And the boreal forest is characterized by having a lot of times a shallower water table. There's trees, there's a fair bit of organic matter in the soil, so it is different. And the precipitation is much different too. So the Kalmar area has a mean annual precipitation of 516 millimeters, and compare that to 602 millimeters for Winfield, Alberta, which is the one we used, and it is due west of the confined feeding operation, still in this green area of the map. So that's the one that we used. Okay, so the model told us 5 useful things about what would happen if there had been a feedlot established. First of all, number 1, runoff production. The model told us that the amount of runoff would increase when the manure spreading lands got tilled. So right now they're grassy pasture, or a fair number of them are grassy pasture, and some of that land is going to be converted over to essentially cropland where they're going to be tilling in the manure, and that's going to increase the amount of runoff that's getting into streams and eventually into the lakes. The second thing it told us about the nutrient loadings is that the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and organic matter, it's not inconsequential. There's a fair bit of load coming because you're getting 4,000 cattle. That's a lot more that's in there right now. Concentrations in water courses, concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus in the 2 streams that feed Pigeon Lake would increase 2 to 10 times. And I'm going to show you that in a minute here. We're going to zero in on that one a bit more. The other thing it tells us, if you increase the number of cattle, the problem gets worse. So it is sensitive to herd size. What about sensitivity to precipitation? We thought maybe it would get worse if you added a lot more precipitation because then you're flushing more across the lands and down towards the lake. But as it turns out, you're getting more water flow, but that's pretty much clean water. And so it's really not as bad as we thought it was. The only problem we would have was if there was a lot of rain, the potential to overflow a catch basin before somebody could come in there and empty it. But in terms of the amount that would get into the lake if the catch basin didn't overflow, it wasn't too bad. So let me just explain a little bit more about the phosphorus and nitrogen in creek water. So this graph here, the yellow bars shows some 2013 data, and that's the average, or what we call a median. I guess it's a measure of central tendency for the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen that were in the 2 creeks. Remember I mentioned there's Tide Creek and Sunset Harbor Creek. Top of the graph here shows the phosphorus, and the bottom shows the nitrogen. Look at the addition that you get from the red. That's if the confined feeding operation comes in. So particularly in Sunset Harbor Creek, where the confined feeding operation is going to be located, that's going to be a huge increase in those numbers. A little bit less in Tide Creek. Sorry, in the phosphorus there. The nitrogen in Sunset Harbor Creek is huge. Look at the length of that bar. It really goes up quite a bit there. So Sunset Harbor Creek is really quite strongly affected by that. And what was our number? What was the surface water guideline we're trying to meet? We want to meet 0, right? Well, this doesn't meet 0. This is showing that the concentrations coming down to the lake are going to be more than 0. So these are 2 of the 7 creeks that feed Pigeon Lake. And so the problem we have there with the 100-year residency time before the nutrients can get flushed out, that's a lot of nutrients coming down towards that lake, at a lake that's already struggling with algae blooms. So this graph is telling us that loading from a confined feeding operation that close to Pigeon Lake is going to cause unacceptable concentration increases in the nitrogen and the phosphorus. On the graph, I do not have the information about the organic matter because that's not something that's measured in the lake, but the problem would be there for that too. That would be degradation of organic matter, causing the use of oxygen and leading to some sensitivity with the animals that depend on dissolved water in there. So fish and insects and that sort of thing. So this is not good news. So let's talk about the decision. You may have caught this on the news here. Alberta regulator rejects feedlot application near Pigeon Lake. So the details are on the NRCB website. You could go and search for GNS cattle, which is the name of the proponent, and you can see the various documents that were submitted for and against the feedlot, but most importantly, the decisions there. So that was there's 2 letters that were written by the application approval officer. One of them was in August 2013, and that's the date of this news report here, and that was the decision. The applicant decided to appeal that decision, and so in October, the result of the appeal was released. And in that one, the decision was the same. It says no, that the due process was followed and the decision stands. There will be no confined feeding operation allowed near Pigeon Lake. I'm going to lead you just through what the decision process is and what it looks like. So when an application approval officer gets an application, this is the process that they have to follow. And if they don't follow the process, that they're at risk of having their decision overturned. So the first thing they have to do is they have to have a look at that application and figure out whether it meets the requirements of the Alberta Agricultural Operations Practices Act. If it meets the requirements, then they have to proceed to the second box. If it doesn't, they deny it. The applicant can go back, amend their application or whatever, and get back in the loop. So presuming that it does meet the requirements, then they have to have a look and figure out whether that development is aligned with municipal development plans. So what they consider is, what does the county say about this? So if we would have a look at what happened with Pigeon Lake, the application was complete, and then it went to the county, and the county doesn't explicitly disallow confined feeding operations, but the county does advocate the work that had been done by the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association, and there were 2 key planning documents: Pigeon Lake Watershed Management Plan and the Pigeon Lake Area Concept Plan. One of them says no intensive livestock operations, and the other one says large-scale confined feeding operations are not appropriate in the Pigeon Lake watershed. So based on that, the answer was no, but do those documents hold credit? That could be argued. So they went another step further. Let's have a look at what happens in the third box. And here's where we got the solid no, because the approval officer denied the application, saying it is inappropriate use of the land and will have unacceptable effects on the community. So I'm going to go into those aspects a little bit further. Okay, let's talk about, first of all, about the appropriate use of land. So here in the red square is where the confined feeding operation would be located. And so when they had a look at the county's municipal development plan, it didn't really speak clearly about large-scale agricultural operations such as feedlots. But they did mention that they endorsed the 2 planning documents put together for Pigeon Lake. The approval officer said that the Pigeon Lake Watershed Management Plan was credible and highly useful, and noted that it had been endorsed by the county back in 2018. So there was a long-standing agreement that this was a good planning document. The Pigeon Lake Area Concept Plan from 2014 was also endorsed by the county. So there was evidence that the county intended to adopt the idea of no intensive livestock operations that was embodied in the Pigeon Lake planning documents. The argument would have been stronger if the county's municipal development plan had been updated to already have that information in there. And my understanding is that that's a work in progress. They're in the process of updating the municipal development plan. Let's talk about effects on the community here. So there is documented history of lake usage, importance, and rehabilitation that was really helpful here. And I've got a lot of text on this one here, but it's all three very important parts. One of them is noting the popularity of the Pigeon Lake area and the number of Albertans who rely on the quality of the water in that lake. The traditional use of the lake area, remember we have 5 First Nations who share a reserve there, and all the people who visit the area. So it is a very important lake to Alberta. Secondly, it was the fact that it's a small watershed. It has that long residence time of anything that gets into the lake there. And that will have a direct and long-lasting impact on the lake's quality and therefore its health. And the third thing was the evidence based on a very strong community in the area who values the lake, was that the proposed confined feeding operation would be incompatible with the vision for future use and health of the lake. And so for those reasons, the CFO was deemed to have long-lasting and negative implications for the community. And the third thing I want to talk about is the environment. I was a little disappointed that the decision didn't talk about my report. But there's a few reasons for that, and it's kind of subtle. They did talk about the manure storage area being too close to the water table. The way the regulations work, you have to have a 1 meter separation. Now, there is a shallow aquifer, bedrock aquifer in the Pigeon Lake area that a lot of farms and residents and communities depend on. And there are some water wells that are pretty close to that. But also where they were planning on putting the manure catch basin, it was too close, and that increases the risk of groundwater contamination. So they said that that would be a problem. Also, there were a number of those shallow groundwater wells that are nearby. You could say, well, we could decommission those wells and it's not a problem. Okay, look at that. But then there was some concern, some verbiage in the decision there about the county and Watershed Association concerns about phosphorus and other nutrients. So why wasn't my report mentioned? I think it wasn't because it wasn't read. I believe it was read. I believe it was because of the process that the application officer has to follow, and whether there would be outcry because Pigeon Lake Watershed Association itself did not have this directly affected party status. So the application officer managed to find a couple of ways to shut down the application without having to tread into that area and risk having its decision overturned. So the approval officer didn't really need it in there. I'm okay with that. Okay, so let me just give you a review of what I've covered so far. I believe that feedlots are not necessarily bad because they help keep the quality of beef acceptable and consistent and affordable to Albertans. There are environmental concerns, however, that stem from cattle manure. We know that runoff into lakes can cause problems with algae production, and it also can cause eutrophication, which is the consumption of dissolved oxygen in the water that can cause suffocation of freshwater aquatic life, fish, and all the things in the food chain that the fish depend on. And I've also reviewed through the case study here that the Pigeon Lake example shows that it is possible to have a feedlot application denied. In the decision letter, the approval officer noted that there had been one other confined feeding operation in Alberta that had been denied for similar reasons. So it can be done. Most of them get approved because they follow the process, but some of them got overturned. Okay, we're going to be opening up the floor to questions pretty soon, so I'm going to I'll start off with a question here myself. So one would be, and I expect that somebody's going to ask this, well, where would you put a confined feeding operation? Where is it safe to put one of these things? Well, based on what I learned from running the model, I think you'd want to choose an area that had some nice loamy soil. So not all sand, not all clay, but a nice mixture, sand, silt, and clay that gave a nice area for manure to be able to naturally biodegrade. You wouldn't want to have too much sand because it could put your groundwater at risk, and you wouldn't want too much clay because you get a lot of overland transport, so something nice in the area. You'd also want to have relatively flat land. You wouldn't want to have it on a hill, for example, because then it's just going to all flow downhill towards wherever the water is going. So somewhere nice and flat. And you'd want to have it distant from significant water bodies. So although Pigeon Lake met the required provincial setbacks, based on the sensitive ecosystem of Pigeon Lake, that is still too close. So greater distance is a good thing. And because of all the other impacts to people, you wouldn't want to have a lot of neighbors. People do not like to live near something that's causing a lot more traffic, a lot more noise, odors, maybe a lot of flies associated with the manure, but concern about groundwater quality, concern about other things there. So find a place that doesn't have a lot of nearby neighbors. So where would you put that? You could probably find places in much of Alberta to put it, but you can see why the grasslands area of Alberta has attracted a lot of feedlots. It is an area that is largely flat, nice soil to be able to manage the manure and that sort of thing. Boreal forest areas tend to have a shallow water table and lots of surface water bodies, so not particularly well suited to confined feeding operations. The other question I'm anticipating people are going to be wondering is, how would you nip an application in the bud? So here's the chart that I showed you before. Well, the best way to be able to do that is to be able to knock it out at the municipal development plan side, because that is very clear. So I understand that we might have some watershed associations listening in on this talk today, and that would be my advice, would be to work with the municipalities to get it written into the municipal development plans where large-scale agricultural operations would not be allowed because of sensitivities and that sort of thing. So that would make it very easy for an approval officer just to be able to go through and be able to answer that question, as opposed to have to go through the third box, which has a lot more speculation involved. So it'd be much more difficult, perhaps, to be able to have a really firm answer there about the economy, the environment, and appropriate use of land. All right, so I've got one more slide here, and this is my end of my presentation, and I want to offer special thanks. I want to thank the Pigeon Lake Watershed Association for letting me work on this project and from letting me borrow some of your photos. I want to thank all of the Pigeon Lake Watershed members, which I understand is close to 1,100 people, for their stewardship in improving lake health. I think it's wonderful to hear about an organization that is taking action like that to protect ecosystems that are of value in Alberta. I want to thank the Athabasca University for inviting me to give this talk here today. And I want to thank my cattle. My cattle help me to better understand relationships between livestock, water, and the land. And they also give me some really good photo opportunities. So thank you very much. At this point, we can turn things over to questions. If they're science-based, I'll take them on. If they're about the Pigeon Lake example, I might lean a little bit on Bob Gibbs here to answer some of those questions. Thank you.
I want to thank Margaret for doing this talk for Science Outreach Athabasca. And if anybody in the audience, I don't have any questions online just yet. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, I will bring the mic over to you, and so that we can with our recording. So are there any questions?
Thanks.
The way you put it, if the Natural Resource Conservation Board person doesn't follow the procedure properly, the application will get improved. That makes it sound like they get approved by default. kind of like a guilty person getting off on a technicality.
It does sound a bit like that, doesn't it? Yeah, so if the application meets all of the requirements of the Agricultural Operations Act, then that means that they've got the required setbacks to protect the environment and prevent there being nuisance to neighbors and that sort of thing. So they made the process very clear so that applicants know what sort of level they need to be able to build and design for. The challenge is that some of the concerns that people may raise about a confined feeding operation. So, for example, people who might complain about health impacts, the approvals officer can't really delve into that because it's not their ability under the Act to be able to comment on that. But what they can do is they can refer that kind of a question to Alberta Health. It's their mandate to work with it. So they just have to be very careful to make sure that they make decisions based only on the information that they're allowed to receive. And that includes including information or relying information on only people that were given status to be able to submit it. To your question there about whether they all get approved, I think a lot of them do because the application meets the requirements. There might be a little bit of pushback from community members. Pigeon Lake, because of its long history of the algae, had a really good argument as to why that was a particularly sensitive ecosystem. A lot of other places in Alberta would have more of a challenge, I suspect, in being able to prove that.
So if there wasn't anybody like you producing a report about how the nitrogen and phosphorus would increase, that factor wouldn't be looked at.
That's true. So there is a risk screening tool that the NRCB uses to try and figure out whether the operation would cause undue impacts to groundwater or surface water. It's based on what most sites in Alberta might look like. From what I saw in my computer model, it doesn't address all sites, and it's useful to be able to have a model like that. But again, to my point, rather than putting the approval officer in the space of having to decide whether he's allowed to use it or not, it's nice if he has a municipal development plan to be able to make the decision sooner so that he doesn't have to look at what the environmental effects are going to be. So I might suggest if a municipality wants to figure out where it can and can't support having a confined feeding operation, they could do that modeling up front and figuring out the areas of their county that would be inappropriate, write it into the municipal development plans. That way you get to do the modeling with a little bit more luxury of time than trying to put it together in 3 weeks. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
So where is the cutoff between intense operation and a regular farming cattle operation? Like if there had been 2,000 cattle, would it have been allowed, or how do people say go right up to the edge?
Yeah, so there are numbers if you have a look in the 4-pager. It depends on what kind of animals you have and how big they are. So this was 4,000, what they call beef finishers. I think the number for that, it becomes a confined feeding operation. I can't remember if it's 150 or 1,000. I'd have to have a look at that, but there's a progressive scale. I think under 150, you don't have to have any application. Over 150, but less than 1,000, I think it's a registration, and more than 1,000 is actually going through the approval process. It's sort of a phased program, and it's different if your animals are poultry or hogs or something like that. So there's a chart that it specifies the number of animals. Good question.
Any other questions?
Thank you for that great presentation. Do you think that there could be any improvements on the side of the Natural Resource Conservation Board in terms of being able to assess different vulnerabilities in an ecosystem before making a decision?
I think they could improve the model that they're using for screening purposes. It's a model that was developed in about 2005, I believe, and it it's sort of looking at the average case for Alberta, and I think they could probably divide the province up and have different screening criteria for different areas. Maybe it's different screening criteria for different ecological subregions, maybe a different one for boreal versus parkland versus grasslands, for example. The model that they're using isn't precise enough, I don't believe.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I'm just curious, what sort of water sources would be required to meet 4,000 animals' demand for water consumption? And you highlighted that it might be good not to install these outfits close to water sources. So how do we get the water for the animals?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the having a water supply for farm animals is dictated under the Water Act for Alberta. So that's a separate application that's required. I can't remember the number of liters per day that cattle use. It's a fair bit, particularly pregnant or lactating cows. They need an awful lot of water. Steers probably a little bit less, but yeah, think about eating dry hay or supplements there. They're going to need water to go with that, right? So typically what happens is the applicants will put in a parallel application to Alberta Environment under the Water Act to get one or more water wells established, and they would have to be able to show that there's a suitable aquifer with proper yield that they can bring the water for the cattle from there. It's a large number. They need industrial water wells for sure.
We have one question online here. For cattle reporting, does Alberta include research on the natural resource that does take into consideration climate change and whether that is a criteria?
No, it does not. That's a really good question. So we had discussions when I was framing my model about what happens with climate change. The model that the NRCB is using right now, I said it was about circa 2005. I believe the initial model was built for that. It's been updated a bit, but it's not looking at climate change. So under climate change, we would expect to get more precipitation and probably warmer weather. So more severe rainfall events, more potential for getting flushing of nutrients towards water bodies. The water bodies themselves would probably increase in temperature. And so think about algae production and growth of plants within those water bodies. I think that climate change could make those water bodies much more susceptible to the impacts from confined feeding operations.
Any other questions online or in the audience?
I was just wondering what the dog's name is.
Well, actually, I'll tell you the story about this. This isn't a dog. This is a little calf. So on our farm, sometimes a cow will have twins. And sometimes when a cow has twins, she doesn't want one of them. And so this is a little calf that was abandoned. And what I do on our farm is when I have an abandoned calf, I tie a bandana around its neck so I know what it is, because black calves kind of all look the same. And what we do is we get them so that they're strong enough from bottle feeding that I can put them out with the rest of the herd. Because the best way for a calf to learn to become a cow or a steer is for them to be with a herd. So when I take them their bottle, they're wearing the bandana, and I can feed them their bottle, and 2 or 3 times a day I have to bring them a large bottle of milk, and they'll drink that. At some point, the calf is not drinking the whole bottle anymore, and that's because the calf has found a cow that's willing to feed her. And so that's what happened with this little one. He went out and found, I think he probably had 2 or 3 mothers that were feeding him. So all the other calves only had 1 mother. He had 3. And we vaccinated him a couple of weeks ago, and he's much bigger than the other ones. But once we find that they're not drinking the bottle and they found some mothers, we can take the bandana off and we don't have to worry about them. But yeah, the little animals are really cute.
We have one more question online here. Do you want the Alberta Cattle Association to partner with with watershed associations?
Well, that would be interesting because I think when you bring people together of different perspectives, there's mutual learning that happens both ways. And there is an organization, for example, that's called Cattle and Fish, and they understand the interactions with what happens with cattle production and water bodies. Bringing the cattlemen in together with this, I think, could be useful, understanding a little bit more about what you need for cattle. I believe confined feeding operations are important to our economy also. We can't afford to have beef get out of the price range of consumers. So if they've got some ways that they can work together to make sure that confined feeding operations continue to feed us and are able to do so cost effectively while maintaining appropriate impacts on the environment, I think that could be a good thing.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Just a more general question. When something's called grass-fed beef, does that mean it hasn't been in a confined feeding operation?
I can speak to this personally because we raise grass-fed beef at our farm. So what we do is we have our calves are born typically around May, and our calves and our cows are on pasture all summer. And then my husband is busy growing hay all summer, and he puts that into bales. And so their winter feed is hay. So they don't get any grain at all. So with our beef, we do butcher for ourselves, and it is grass-fed. It tastes different. It doesn't have the marbling. It's leaner. They say it's healthier. Sadly, when we go to take most of our cattle to the market, we don't have access to an organic butcher that takes them large scale for us. So a lot of our cattle do end up going to a feedlot, which is kind of sad. At that point, they're fed rations and they're no longer grass-fed beef. Supply and demand, I guess.
I just want to ask another question about confined feeding operations and calculations like this. We focused, or I see that you focused in this model on phosphorus and nitrogen, but are there calculations that can also consider other implications of confined feeding operations on the environment, like the chemicals that are used to treat hoof rot, or the promoters that are added to fatten the cattle, or antibiotics that are used to ensure that the cattle are healthy while they're in the confined space? And what is can it be measured, and what kinds of potential impacts can that have on the environment as well?
Yeah, so that would be building a custom model, essentially. The United States Environmental Protection Agency model that I used didn't look at those things. If you wanted to have a tool that did that, what it would involve would be doing a literature review to try and figure out what the effects are, and then building some sort of a model that replicated the kinds of processes that the literature talks about to be able to figure out, how many animals are getting these treatments, for example, and what happens to what the medication when it either wears off an animal or whether they excrete it, and then how that ends up going down the line. Yeah, but that's often in doing human health risk assessment, I would do things like that. It's called multimedia exposure assessment, but that's building purpose-built models. I use spreadsheets for doing that sort of thing. So one of the ones that I built, for example, was, I don't know if you remember, Health Canada about around 1994 came up with guidance for the amount of dental amalgam that's acceptable to have in people's teeth. And I helped build that model, and it was looking at, well, how many times do you brush your teeth, and how much mercury vapor are you emanating from your fillings when you brush them, and how much are you swallowing and excreting and that sort of thing. So it can be done. It's just, it can be computationally large. Just and trying to make sure that you have enough information in the body of knowledge to build the model, but there is a way to do it.
Is that something that the Natural Resource Conservation Board is looking at when they make those decisions?
I don't know if they're looking at it, but I think that would be something that you could bring to their attention. They are the ones who are charged with overseeing what happens with confined feeding operations in the province, and that might be something that interests them.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
I didn't bring any chocolate chip cookies today. I know
there are some
you wouldn't
cookies in
trust
those.
me.
Well, I would like to thank you on behalf of Science Outreach, Margaret, for coming out and doing this presentation for us. And thank you all for coming tonight. We'll close tonight's session off, and I don't believe I have any more. Oh, I do have one.
One more question? Okay, let's have one more question. Yep.
Oh, it just says Cows and Fish is the organization. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the cows and fish. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's great. Well,
Okay.
thank you very much for having me tonight. This is a great story to be able to share, and it's wonderful to have an audience to be able to share it with. Thank you.
Thank you.